I don't know about you, but that video depresses me. Used to be a time when that wouldn't be the case, but right now it kind of depresses me because it reminds me of so many truths that are really uncomfortable, that you can't control time. I want to slow time down, I want to speed time up. You've been there, I've been there, we've all felt it. You can't do it though, you can't control it, you can't stop time. You can't just hit the pause button like a DVR and just kind of wait for it till you catch up or catch your breath for the rest of it to go on. You can't get time back. Again, that's right now in my life, that's one of the things I wish I could do the most with a kid that's starting college tomorrow, 10 hours away. Wish you could get some time back. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can't. And the reality is our time is limited. And every time I get up and I feel a new ache that's never going to go away, or I look a lot different than I did 20 years ago, I think that my time is getting short. I'm getting old. Well, today's key idea is I offer my time to fulfill God's purposes. I offer my time to fulfill God's purposes. The concept is simple enough. We offer our time, the time that we have, to do what God wants us to do. It makes sense. But the topic is actually a tough topic because, as the video said, all of us at one time have both wished for time to pass quickly and hoped to slow down time at different times in our lives. Sometimes we feel like this meme, maybe you've seen it before, when you think you've been working for 4 hours and it's only been 17 minutes. You're in a job you don't like, you're at school and something's not, there's a class that you don't like, and it's just like, it feels like time is creeping along, and you spend a week somewhere 1 hour, right? It's kind of that kind of feeling. And other times we start talking about things that happened, a couple years ago until our spouse reminds us that was 15 years ago. We forget what time feels like, and it just passes so quickly. And time is such a unique commodity because while we cannot control time or we cannot stop time, we, as the video said, can certainly choose how do we use our time. And while none of us can know or really influence the total amount of time we have, time is the great equalizer because every one of us this morning woke up and we had a finite amount of physical resources. Each of us had a different amount of net worth. We had a different amount in our bank account. Every one of us did. Some of us have more, some of us have little. Some of us have a lot, some of us have none. Maybe even some of us have a negative number at this point. That happens sometimes. It all varies across this congregation. But this morning, each of us woke up, and Lord willing, we will have the exact same amount of time today at our disposal. Moving forward, we'll have 24 hours each day. We'll have 168 hours each week. Well, as you know, I'm a bit of a nerd about the ancient biblical languages, and I like to study the original Hebrew and the original in the Hebrew in the Old Testament and Greek in the New Testament, with the little Aramaic spread in there here and there. But often in the Greek language, as you may know, there are multiple words that are translated as a single English word. The most famous, you've probably heard, is the word love. That, we talk about loving our spouse and loving our children and loving our God and loving cheeseburgers and loving our sports teams and loving our cars, and certainly it's a different kind of love, and the Greeks had a different word for different kinds of love. They had philos and eros and agape and storge, and all those had different connotations of what love meant. Well, this is also the case for this word time. In the biblical Greek, there are actually two words that are used for the word time. The first one is chronos. Now, chronos is time as we generally think about it. It's you get the word chronological from that word. It's second by second, minute by minute, and hour by hour, day by day. Chronological. That's what we kind of typically think of when we think of time. That we've got something to do on Tuesday at noon, or we've only got another hour left in this worship assembly, or and so on and so forth. The other word, though, is this word that you've heard me talk about in different contexts before, but it's the word kairos. Kairos. Now, kairos is a moment in time. It's not necessarily bound by a specific, Tuesday morning at 8. It's just a moment in time that is seen as an opportunity. Just a moment in time where there is an opportunity to do something. So let's go back to that key idea again. I offer my time to fulfill God's purposes. Well, I would suggest to you that one of the main reasons we don't accomplish this key idea in our lives is that we generally operate on Chronos time instead of Kairos time. Living on Chronos time means that our lives are determined by schedules and appointments. Now, there's nothing wrong with schedules. There's nothing wrong with appointments. It's kind of needed for the world to run at least somewhat smoothly. It's required. It's part of our lives. But if that's the way we choose to live our lives, then we're going to miss out on something. It reminds me when I was in youth ministry. When I started youth ministry, as any youth minister would, I planned different kinds of events. And what I would plan is I'd plan some that were kind of focused on spiritual development, so like Bible studies, things like that. I would do some events that were like just for fun and fellowship, just to get together. And maybe the most spiritual thing we did was pray during that time. And then we'd have some that were kind of a hybrid, where we'd do like church camp or CIY, where we'd go have fun, but we'd also spend time in the spiritual things. But when it came to the events that were just for fun and fellowship, I started out in my ministry about 21 years ago. I'd have two different kinds of events as I was trying to kind of find my bearings and learn how to minister. I would either have a completely free-flowing event or one that was highly planned out, highly structured, and highly scheduled. The problem is that both of those events had serious issues. Now, the free-flowing event sounds like a good idea, and sometimes they were. Sometimes they would be really good. You just kind of show up and say, we're all going to meet at this place at this time, and then we're just going to have fun. We're just going to let it go. In fact, I remember having one at my house one time where I said, come to my house, and we're not going to have any plan. We're just going to get some food, and we're just going to hang out. Well, the problem with that particular gathering is that when there's no plan, people can get bored very easily. We were looking around, we got done with the pizza, and everybody's just kind of standing around. Well, okay, what are we going to do? And I'm like, well, we could go play in the yard, I guess, or we could go, dodge traffic. I don't know, something kind of fun. But there was no plan, and so it quickly kind of got out of hand because it was just, everybody was bored. Also, when you have no plan, sometimes they can get really chaotic, depending on how many people you have there, or sometimes depending on the type of people you have there. It can get very chaotic very quickly. Well, the scheduled event, though, it also had its pitfalls. Because what would happen is I would say, okay, we're going to be here for 2 hours. I need 2 hours of activities, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have this game. It's going to be from 7 to 7:15, and this was going to be a get-to-know-you game. It's going to be from 7:15 to 7:35. We're going to have pizza from 7:35 to 8, so on and so forth, and that kind of thing. And I would spend a lot of time coming up with activities, and sometimes those of you that worked in youth ministry before as volunteers know that sometimes a lot of those games require planning and require supplies, so you got to go to the store, maybe you got to put stuff together, you kind of do all that. And so when I put all that effort into that schedule and plan, I kind of felt like I was obliged to stick to it. I put all that effort in it, all that time and money sometimes. I don't want to just kind of skip an activity. So no matter how well a game or activity was going, when the schedule said it was time to move on, we were going to move on because we were there to have fun and we were going to do it whether we liked it or not. Right? It's the schedule. It's just we got to do it. We got to move on. We got to do the next thing. Of course, I was missing the point altogether in that. The point altogether there is that if we're coming together just to have fun and I have a schedule, then maybe if there's one game or one activity that is really clicking, maybe we just ought to do that for the rest of the time. And I learned that as I matured, as I grew in youth ministry. That's what happens when we live on Chronos time only. When we live on Chronos time only, we are stuck to the schedule. We see what's next. We got to go. We got to move from point A to point B, and then we got from this event to that event, from that activity to that activity, from that appointment to this appointment, and we just have a life that's so structured and focused on time. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be appointments. It can just be, this is how my life works, maybe out of habit. I remember this last week, Carrie's in school. And the girls were in band, and so it was Jocelyn and I at the house. And I had her for 3 days by myself. And in those 3 days, the first two were great. Actually 4 days, but the first 3 days were great because I got up and she was still asleep, and that was really nice. Okay. And then the fourth day was a little rougher though because she was awake when I got up. Now, Jocelyn is one of the sweetest girls you'll ever meet, but she's also a ball full of energy. And I have a little routine when I get up. I want no one to talk to me or even look at me for at least 10 minutes. I want to get my cup of coffee. I want to sit down in my chair. I want to settle down. I want to wake up. Of course, that was not her plan. She wanted to talk. She wanted to do this and this. I was like, honey, can you just go upstairs and leave Daddy alone for 10 minutes? And she said, sure, Daddy. And she did that. And so that's kind of why we get into those habits, those things that we like, that we got to kind of have our routine, and we live by this chronos time, and that's how our lives work. But let me give you a good example of living on kairos time. A while back, Melanie Moore had come in contact with someone who had been in an accident. I'm not sure exactly what had happened, how she came in contact with him, whether she was there, but she kind of had met this person and was in an accident, and they were in the hospital. And it was Sunday morning, and Melanie brought her kiddos to church, and Devron apparently was out of town at the time. By the way, I did tell her I was going to talk about her today. That's why she's not here this morning. I'm just kidding. And Devron was out of town, and I don't know if you realize how hard it is to do stuff with 3 young children, but it ain't easy. And it's even harder to do certain activities like take them to a hospital where it's not exactly, kid-friendly. And so Melanie realized the opportunity that was in front of her. And she asked Lindy if it was okay to leave the kids for a bit and to run to the hospital to visit the person in the hospital, which, of course, Lindy encouraged her to do. And when I heard that story, I was like, yes, that's exactly what it's all about. Chronos time would say, okay, well, this is time for church. I got to go to church. I got to go be a part of this. I'm going to do this. But Kairos time said, you know what? Even though I'm at church, I can take this opportunity to go and minister to someone. I can take this opportunity to go and love someone. As Jake was talking, I thought that was another good example of Kairos time. I don't know about you, but when you get a job and it's a pretty good job, and it's, even though it's not perfect, you kind of don't want to switch things up. It gets comfortable. You get your routine, particularly when you have kids. And I'm guessing that's probably part of what Carrie's issue was with, Carrie, right? That you kind of got this routine, and now you're going to throw it all up and start all over with this routine again. But the thing I loved about Jake in that moment, because again, he talked to me throughout that, asked me to pray for him, and as I was listening to him, it was not about, oh, this is a great opportunity financially for me, or oh, this is a great opportunity for my schedule, or oh, this is a great opportunity for this, that, and the other. The one thing that Jake was focused on was that this is an opportunity for me to minister. In fact, I'm sorry, Jake, to talk about you without your permission, but he asked me at one point, am I wrong for thinking this is a way to have a second chance at a screwed up mission? And I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think of it that way, but that should take into account. And Jake's focus, first and foremost, is how can God use this? How can God use me in this? And so that was a Kairos moment as well. Well, the Bible speaks a lot about time. Ecclesiastes talks about how there's a time for everything. I'm sure some of you can break out the bird song and sing it to us this morning. Please don't, but I'm sure you could. A time to be born, a time to die, time to weep, time to laugh, time to be silent, time to speak, etc., etc. Haggai talks about how we need to use our time for God before ourselves, as the people were building houses for themselves before God, and God said, that's not the way this is supposed to work. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus talks about how the use of time is tied to judgment. Remember, we talked about this many times before, but Jesus divides the people into sheep and goats, and the sheep were the ones that served and helped the poor. Gave them something to drink when they were thirsty, gave them something to wear when they were naked, gave them something to eat when they were hungry, and they said, when did we do this? And Jesus said, when you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. And so we don't think of necessarily that as being a time passage, but it was really talking about how they spent their time and how they used their time for God. But it's in Ephesians that we find this principle of living in Kairos time most specifically. It's Ephesians chapter 5, starting with verse 15. This is what the Apostle Paul writes. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Now the Apostle Paul starts by talking about being careful as to how we live. Be very careful then how you live. I like the way the New American Standard Version puts it. The New American Standard says, therefore be careful how you walk. Living and walking, you can kind of see the similarities, but I really like this picture of walking because it kind of gives you an idea of how we are then to live. Using the walking metaphor, it's the difference between walking on a solid floor like you did today. When you walked in here, I didn't see anybody test out the floor before they took a step. You were pretty confident. You walked in and you just kind of had faith that it was going to be okay. But have you ever been in a building in which you had to kind of walk? I tell you what, go out here to this back thing that needs a little work. We got a little wooden ramp over here. Don't go out there, actually. We don't need a lawsuit. But that's the kind of thing where you need to kind of test your step before you make the step. We've all been on situations like that. That's the difference that Paul is talking about here. He's saying don't just walk around willy-nilly, but actually be careful where you're stepping. Make sure you're stepping in the right place. It's the difference that would exist between walking through the mall or walking over a balance beam over Niagara Falls. When you walk to the mall, if you want to go to the mall this afternoon, you're probably just going to walk normally. But if you're walking over the balance beam over Niagara Falls, if you could get up there in the first place, you're probably going to be paying very close attention to where you step, knowing there's a lot at stake. I've noticed something about myself after living in Southeast Texas for over 7 years, almost 8, that when I walk outside, I'm always on the lookout for fire ants. I always got to watch for fire ants because, whenever you know how it is, you can put the little stuff on it in your yard, but that just moves them to a different place. And you got to do that. And then you can get the exterminators to come over. They can do your whole yard, and that just moves them to the neighbor's yard. And that's not very nice. But you got to watch for those things. And I've also found that if I'm walking around and the ground under my feet feels a certain way, I have a tendency to do the fire ant dance. Do you know what that is? Where you kind of feel something a little softer maybe, and you kind of do you want to make sure you shake it off or whatever. You know what I'm talking about, right? You do the same thing. You get that little fire ants thing, and you do that because you've stepped on hills before. You know what it feels like. And I've noticed that if I feel like something is crawling on my leg or foot, that I will quickly spring into action and make sure I don't get bit. I'll slap at it or whatever the case may be and look like a fool in front of whoever's watching. But I realize that I'm so used to walking carefully, looking for fire ants, that I'll have the same reaction in areas of the country where there are no fire ants. Up at my mom and dad's house. Now, they got rattlesnakes, but they don't got fire ants. And so, you got to, but I still act the same way, or not even necessarily on in grass. Sometimes I'll be walking down a sidewalk in a city at a conference, and I'll feel something, and it'll make me do the fire ant dance. Because I'm so used to that watching out and being very careful how I walk in my normal everyday life that it's become a part of who I am. And that's what Paul is talking about here. That you live in such an accurate, precise, and intentional life that it really becomes second nature to you. And to do that, we are to be wise of how we live, making the most of every opportunity. And wouldn't you know that it just so happens that the word translated as opportunity in this passage is the word kairos. Opportunity, a moment in time. Paul then gives further instruction on how to do this in the next verse. He says in verse 17, "Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is." And so we should trade foolishness for understanding. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, we're not only against God's will when we sin. That's the easy one to understand and the easy one to kind of grasp, that whenever we do things according to God's word, when we sin, then we are living foolishly. But also, the step further of that is when we don't follow his instructions and his call in our lives to partner with him, that's also being foolish. And so foolishness here in this verse is anything that is not aligned with God's will. And it may not be inherently sinful, but it may just be something that's not aligned with God's will. And anything that's not aligned with God's will is foolish and a waste of time. Again, it may not be inherently sinful, but it may be something that suddenly becomes an idol to us because it's a waste of time, or we're not doing what God has called us to do. Our jobs can become idols if we don't use it for God. Our families can become idols. Our hobbies can become idols. Our idle time can become idols. But it seemed Jesus understood this concept of aligning ourselves with God's will. In John chapter 5, verse 19, Jesus said this, and Jesus gave them this answer, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. Because whatever the Father does, the Son also does." There used to be this game that was kind of popular. It was I think it was an Xbox thing you could put up on your TV, and you could control the game by your actions, by your movement. And they got the Wii and some of those things too, but this was just a camera that would watch you do what you do. And so you could do this, and this would do something for the game, or you could do that. And the person, sometimes you could like do the dance thing. Some people could do it. I couldn't do it. But some people could do the dance thing and move a certain way, and the person on screen would do exactly what you were doing. And that's what Jesus said he was doing. He said he would have his eyes on the Father, and whatever the Father made a move, then and only then would Jesus make a move. Whatever God was doing, that's what he would do. And if you look at what the Son, if you look at what Jesus did in his life, I think you can see that he offered his time to fulfill God's purposes in four big ways. There may be some others, but there are four big ways that Jesus used his time to fulfill God's purpose. First one is prayer. We see throughout the New Testament that Jesus withdrew to pray. By the way, how are you to know what the Father is doing if you don't pray? And Jesus knew that he needed to take that time to pray with others, to pray by himself. And he spent time, intentional time, praying to fulfill God's purpose. The second thing he did was relationships. Jesus was always around people, which again, as an introvert, freaks me out. But he was always around people. He was with the big crowds a lot. He was around the smaller crowds a little bit more. And he was around his disciples quite a bit more. And he was around the three, Peter, James, and John, even more. And what happened is, you see, it really, relatively big crowds versus Peter, James, and John, the difference was very stark, the amount of time that Jesus spent with them. It's kind of interesting if you think about it, because if he knew he had 30-ish years on this earth, I don't know, if I was Jesus, I'd think I need to spend my time with as many people as I can. But that's not what Jesus did. He spent time with a very few people, because he knew that building relationships was the way to accomplish God's purposes. And that's why we see in the book of Acts how those three, Peter, James, and John, and then the other disciples, they became the church, and they became the missionaries that started this Christian movement, this church that changed the world. And so Jesus offered his time for God's purposes through relationships. But he also did for mission. You can call it a lot of different things. His healing, preaching, confronting. He healed a bunch of people. He would go from place to place and he would heal for God's glory. He would preach. We have all sorts of teachings and preachings of Jesus. He would confront people, particularly the religious people. By the way, I still think it's incredible that the only people that Jesus was ever harsh to were the Pharisees, were the church people. And he confronted them. He called them out on their sin. He called them out on their misconceptions about God. And so Jesus spent time in prayer, relationships, mission, and then here's a biggie that most of us forget. He spent time on rest. We see Jesus, again, withdrawing. Matthew chapter 14. We have the story of how Jesus went and he fed thousands of people. You know the story. Just a few loaves and fish. He miraculously fed thousands of people. And after that, it says that he withdrew. That he took off and he left the crowds. And I think you can see in the rhythm of Jesus' life that he intentionally set aside time to recover, to rest. And I think that is one of the maybe biggest overlooked things that we don't do. In this society, we feel like if we're not doing anything, we're being lazy. And so rest seems like a lazy thing, but God says clearly in his word, to fulfill his purposes, we must rest. We must Sabbath. So prayer, relationships, mission, and rest. Those are the four things that Jesus really spent his time on for God's purposes. And these are the ways that we too can use our time to fulfill God's purposes. We need to be praying each and every day that God goes ahead of us in what we do in our lives. We need to be praying for our congregation each and every day that God will grow us deep and wide, that he will put us in contact with people who need Jesus so that we can bring them to Christ, and so he can use us to do so. And by the way, along with that, we need to be spending time in those relationships. We need to be building the relationships amongst one another. We talked about spiritual gifts last week, and in our class this morning that was talked about again. It's so important to have community so I can point those things out and build those up in you, and you can do the same thing for me, and we can keep each other in line. We need to build those relationships because we are not the best if we're not with each other. And not only that, but you got to have a relationship with people who don't know Jesus if we expect to bring them to Jesus. And then we need to spend time on mission, on God's mission, the things that he's called us to do, to use our gifts, to accomplish God's purposes. And again, that holistic mission that we find whatever area of this world is not aligning with God's will and do our part to make it and restore it and reconcile it to God. And we too need to spend our time in rest, to spend our time in the Sabbath, to set that time apart so that God can recharge us and have us ready for the next steps as he leads us. As often is the case, that's the thing about this series, honestly. Sometimes I think there's some things that are really revelatory, and I think there's some other times where it's just kind of a, well, duh. These things are not new to you. We may not be good at all these things, but they're not new to you. I doubt these things come as much as a surprise. And I'm sure you realize, though, that we should use our time for God. And I'm sure that those 4 things on the screen are not new ideas to you. No, I think what we need to do in regards to this topic is to have some practical tips of how to actually accomplish it, to actually put into action the belief that we are to use our time for God's purposes. And so I borrowed a list of practical tips from another preacher, how we can manage our time better. I'm going to call it 11 tips for Christian time management, if you will. And some of these are common sense type of practical things that you probably would agree with or maybe seen before. Some that are not exactly pulled directly out of Scripture, but things that will help us to apply Scripture better. And some of them are directly biblical, but all of them, I believe, will help us to use our time for God's purposes. Number 1, here we go. Take notes if you want to, or I'll send it to you, but these are tips that we need for Christian time management to do better at using our time for God's purposes. Number 1, plan your time. All right, I'm going to start a division within the church right now. How many of you are list keepers? You like to write a list down? Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you prefer not to write a list and just kind of go, okay, all right, we're going to divide the list people. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a not list guy. I got to tell you, I'm a not list guy. I don't like writing lists down. I don't like to be constrained by the lists. You know, I want to be able to do what I want to do and kind of get it done. But if I'm honest with myself, I have a tendency to make lists in my head. Lindy and I are very different in that regard. If you go to come here during the week, she'll have a list of things she needs to do for the week, and I'll have it in my head. If you ask me, what are you doing this week? I'll say, I don't know. I've got this, and this. And she'll say, well, here, I'll tell you. But we need to plan our time. We need to plan our time. And I think whether we make lists or not, we will be able to be more able to use our time for God and wisely for God if we are intentional about it. That's the key. It's not so much that God expects us all to write a list down. It's just that He expects us to be intentional about our time. To know that, okay, I've got 24 hours, and what am I going to do with it today? And we have some commitments that we have to do. We've got some that we have choices about. So let's figure out what we're going to do. Planning on whatever level we do so will help make sure that we are planning to give time to God. Because you know what happens, right? Happens to you and it happens to me, is that those things that are negotiable, if you don't plan them into your day, those are the things that will get pushed to the end and then you won't do it. That's just the way it works. So we got to plan our time. Number 2, leave margin for the unexpected. In Mark chapter 5, we see Jesus is met by a man named Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, and Jairus tells Jesus that his daughter is very sick, and he asks Jesus to come with him, and Jesus agrees to do so. And Jesus is walking to this man's house, and something happens as he's walking to the house. A woman who had been hemorrhaging for years touched Jesus' garment in faith, believing that even touching his cloak would heal her. Now, remember, Jesus was on his way to a little girl's house who was very sick to heal her. That seems like a pretty important task. But in that moment, he allowed himself to be interrupted by the woman. He stopped. He talked to her. He healed her. I believe we often fail at using our time for God's purposes because we don't leave time in our lives to be interrupted. We don't leave that margin for the unexpected. You've probably heard this story. It's a great story. I got to tell it again. It's a young preacher's kid. Mark Scott was a professor at Ozark Christian College. He told of a Sunday morning when he was a minister of a church, and they were this particular Sunday morning, the family struggled to get around on time. I don't know if you can relate to that, but we certainly can. It's kind of hectic just to get into the car and get there in time. And when you're the preacher, when you're the minister, you have duties. It's a little even more so stressful because you got to get there at the right time. And so by the time they were piled into the car, they were running late, and they were hurriedly made their way to church. And while driving to church, they passed someone on the side of the road who was broken down. And Mark's young son, he noticed the disabled vehicle, and he said, "Daddy, do those people need help?" And just kind of in a hurry, he said, "Yes, son, they do." And so he continues on, and he thought for a second. He says, "Well, Daddy, are we going to help them?" And Mark's responded and said, "No, son, we have no time. We're already late. We got to get to church." And it got quiet in the back seat for a moment, and the son processed the situation, and he broke the silence once again. He said, "Don't worry, Daddy. Maybe a non-Christian who doesn't have to go to church will stop and help them." And Mark said, ouch, right? That's an ouch moment. That maybe somebody that doesn't love Jesus will stop and help that person. If we manage our time well, then we can allow for God type of interruptions in our life. If we manage our time well, if we leave margin, we can say, you know what? I have to do this, but it's okay because here's a kairos moment. Here's an opportunity for me to serve God and to fulfill His purposes. So plan your time, leave margin for the unexpected. Number 3, do one thing and finish it. Now, I gotta tell you, I don't necessarily agree with this one, okay? I don't necessarily agree with this one because multitasking is okay, I think. I think it's completely okay to multitask. But I do agree on this one point. If your life is full of unfinished projects, it's going to lead to chaos. If you've got about 1,000 things that you need to get done and you've started on about 999 of them, don't go to number 1,000 to get it done. Because it will only lead to chaos, and that will send our life into a frenzy, and we're not able to efficiently use our time for God. And so, if you have something going on, finish it. Finish it. Number 4, learn to say no. That's a tough one sometimes. Have you ever thought about the amazing things that Jesus did? All the miracles, making lame people walk again, blind people were seeing, healing people, raising them from the dead, casting out demons. He's feeding people with with a few loaves and a few fish. He's walking on water. He's doing all these things, all of them for the glory of God. And then usually what we do is he'd use that to show them the Father and lead them to God. And you see all that happening. But have you ever thought about what Jesus didn't do? Again, he had 30 plus years on this earth. And yet he did not decide that it was best for him to heal every person on the face of the earth. He did not spend his time with every person. He didn't preach everywhere. He didn't say, I only have 30 years. In fact, as we read in Scripture, his ministry really didn't even start until later in life. He spent all that time preparing and getting ready. No, even Jesus picked and chose what was most important, and even more so, as John chapter 5 said, he only did what the Father led him to do. Well, church, I would suggest to you that if Jesus had to say no, we probably better too. We need to as well. We need to be constantly evaluating what God will have us do and what is best for the use of our time. Now, by the way, some of us like to look at that number 4 and say, yes, I can use that as an excuse to get out of the things I don't want to do. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got to learn to say no. It's learning to say no to the right things. Again, using our time and knowing what's best. You see, sometimes when we use our time, it's not just a clear cut of right or wrong. In fact, I would say that 95% of the decisions you'll make in life about how you use your time is not this is right and this is wrong. Those are the easy ones, right? Should I go help my neighbor move his couch, or should I go to the strip club? Okay, yeah. That's not a tough decision, right? Or it shouldn't be anyway. But most of them are, should I go help my neighbor move his couch, or should I go help my mother-in-law paint her house? Should I go help? Of course, it's mother-in-law, right? Should I, what's the answer there? Because we have, should I spend my money on the homeless people, or should I give it to Harvest House? We have these decisions that we have to make, and 95% of them is not so much what is right or wrong, it's what is best. What's the best use of my time? I remember early on, one of the things I did when I came to this congregation is I kind of tried to find out a bunch of different things that were available to me to get involved. And a couple of things I did, one of the first things I did is I went to a ministerial prayer meeting. It was an evening prayer meeting. I think it was in Silsbee. And I went up and I went to be a part of that, and it was fine. It was good. It was perfectly fine. But what I realized is the frequency with which they were meeting and the context of the meetings and things like that, it just wasn't the best use of my time. When I first got here also, I trained with the police and clergy and police partnership. I did the police training and all that kind of stuff. And after you finish that, they want you to come and want you to ride around with the police on a regular basis and all these different things. And I had to stop and take a look at that. Before I took that step, I said, okay, what's best here? Spending my time 2 nights a week in a police car, or spending my time with the people of the congregation? And so I had to say, what's best here? Both of those are good examples, or good ideas. There's nothing wrong with them. In fact, I think I'm very happy that there are people involved in that. But sometimes you have to learn to say no so we can figure out what the best thing is to do. Saying no to something good helps us to do what is best. Number 5, separate the important from the urgent. One of my most important roles after my dad's accident was to serve as support to my mother in whatever way I could. And almost immediately after the horror of an accident like that is met with the practicality of life that continues. Bills that have to be paid. In her case, the small farm with all the animals and what to do with them. And really, it just doesn't stop. Again, time doesn't pause when things like that happen. And so I had to figure out how to help her through that. And one of my mom's biggest weaknesses is worry. She gets it honest. My grandfather is one of the biggest worriers I've ever met. My mother is close behind him. I'm hoping to break the cycle, but there's no guarantees. But she is worried about this, and this, and all sorts of things. And you can imagine when something traumatic happens like that, it only amplifies that worry. Because those of us that worry, we think of the worst. And then when the worst actually happens, it only confirms our worry, right? See, I was right to worry. Look what happened. And so it just kind of builds this cycle of worry. Well, worry is not a quality that is helpful when you are thrusted in the role of the primary decision maker of the family. That was not helpful for my mom at that moment. And so just a couple of days after Dad's accident, sitting in a Panera Bread across from the hospital in Wichita, Kansas, I gave my mother what might be the most important piece of advice I've ever given her. I said, Mom, you need to triage your thoughts. You know what a triage is, right? If you go to the emergency room, if you're hurt, and say you cut your finger with a knife, they're going to check out and find out what your problem is. And if you have a cut on your finger and I walk in with a gunshot wound, they're going to send me in first, hopefully, right? Because they know that's the most urgent, that's the most important thing to deal with at that moment in time. My finger can wait, but my head wound has to be taken care of immediately. And I said, Mom, you've got to triage your thoughts, because the reality is that we have a tendency, and she had a tendency at that moment to think about, okay, what's this going to look like 10 years from now? What's it going to look like 5 years from now? What about this? What about that? And I'm just like, we got to deal with what's in front of our faces right now. And it'll do us no good to think about those things and focus on those issues. We got to focus on what is most urgent. And I think the same can be true in our lives as well. You know, even today I'll tell her when she gets overwhelmed with something, I'll say, Mom, all I have to say is triage. She goes, okay. And that's what we need to do with our life. We need to say, okay, whenever we start thinking about our time, what is important, separate the important from the urgent. Because there's a lot of things that are important that we need to spend time on. But some of them are not as urgent as others. And when we can separate the important from the urgent, it will allow us to focus and do what God has called us to do in that moment. Number 6, be decisive. And this is not just an issue of being able to make decisions, but knowing what you're going to base your decisions on. We got to avoid, when it comes to spending our time, this idea of paralysis by analysis. Because again, the problem is when there's no right or wrong, when it's only what's best, then if you're like me, you're like, I want to do what's best. You know, I don't want to just do I know it's not right or wrong, so how do I know what's best? And we spend time thinking about it and overthinking it. And so we need to be decisive, because we'll waste so much time if we're not decisive. But I'll tell you what will make it so much easier. What will make it so much easier is not just that we say, okay, I'm going to be decisive, I'm going to make a decision, but know what your foundation for decision making is going to be. Set in your mind and in your life that when a decision comes up, when my time is divided, here are the criteria I'm going to use to decide. What's the purpose here? How's God going to be glorified? What's the ramifications long term? Is this a one-time commitment or a long-term commitment? Think of those criteria, and so that you can make decisions not on a whim, not under stress, but under a circumstance in which you've already pre-thought it out. Number 7, write it down. Again, I don't necessarily agree completely with this one. Because I don't use a calendar. I don't like to use a calendar. I don't like to write it down. I just kind of keep it in my head, and I kind of look at the week coming ahead, what's going on, I got to figure this out. But then I realized something about a month ago. I asked my wife, what time is that doctor's appointment I have coming up? And I realized that I actually maybe am a calendar person. I just have somebody that writes it down for me. And I think we do. We need to write it down. We have to keep track of it. Again, it's not nothing legalistic where you have to have a written calendar or a Google calendar or whatever. But regardless, we should make sure that we know what we are committed to. And that should play into how we decide to use our time. Number 8, be time conscious. There are 2 things here I think we can learn by comparing our time to money in particular. First of all, I think it will help us to know what our time is worth. Money is a little easier to manage because we can assign a value to it, right? We have dollar figures. And so we kind of compare. We know that how much a house costs versus how much a candy bar costs. And we know, therefore, that it's not prudent to spend $150,000 on a Snickers. As hungry as we are, it's not smart to do so. And so we kind of have this value. We kind of know what it is. But we oftentimes make decisions then to spend our money based on what we think something is worth. About 15 years ago, we moved to Ohio, and one of the first things we wanted to do was to get a dog. And so we decided we were going to go to Toledo, which is about a 45-minute drive away. And we were going to go to the shelter. We were going to adopt a rescue dog. We were going to rescue a dog there. We took our family, and we rented a house at the time, and we got all the permission from the renter, the landlord, to do this, to get a dog. And so we were there, and we found a dog, and it was a little white fluffy one. I don't remember what kind it was, a little white fluffy dog, and it was great. And so we got to the thing to go and to fill out the paperwork, and on the paperwork it says, do you rent or own? And I was honest and said, I rent. Well, the problem with that is that at the adoption agency, they will not give you a dog unless you have the landlord's permission explicitly. In other words, you have to have a letter, or they have to talk to him on the phone. Well, it was a Saturday, and they couldn't get a hold of my landlord, and so basically, long story short, they refused to let us adopt this dog. Well, now I've got 3 kids that are bawling their eyes out because I promised them we were going to get a puppy, and now there's no puppy. So what does Dad do? Okay, I got to find a pet store. So we look around in Toledo. We have several pet stores or whatever, and we decide to go. We find one, and one of the kind of dogs that we kind of liked, because I had a friend that had one, was a little toy Yorkie. You know, little Yorkies are just really cute dogs. You know, we knew we wanted a little dog. We thought that'd be a cute dog to have, and so we went to this pet store, and I went into the pet store, and they had a Yorkie, and it was right there on the wall of dogs. You know, and I should have known when it said special today only, $300 off, that it was going to be a problem. Because we were looking at spending like $100 for an adoption fee for this. And so I went to the counter. I said, can you tell me how much the toy Yorkies are? Oh yeah, the special today, they are only $1,400. And so we got Stoops for $120, a little Chihuahua Terrier rat that we got, and she was cheap, but she was good. So that's the way we do our money, right? We decide this is not worth it. This is not worth it. And so we should do the same thing with our time. To say, okay, you know what? If you really thought about how much time we spend on certain things, we'd say, is this really worth the time I'm going to put into this? Or the time I'm wasting doing this? Is this really worth the time? So we need to know what our time is worth, but also we got to know how much time we have. Not only did I not buy that Yorkie because $1,400 is a lot for a dog, I also bought it because I didn't have $1,400 in my bank account. I didn't have the money. And so you got to know what you have. And so if we keep track and understand of what we have, and always kind of keep this sense of urgency and not get overwhelmed by this sense of morbid mortality, but understand that our time on earth is limited. And if our time on earth is limited, that really adds value to the time we have right now. And so we got to imagine just how much differently we would spend our time if we were always conscious about what we had available to us. Which brings us to number 9, account for your time. Again, I compare this to money. I think it's a great comparison. I've done 2 really important studies in my life financially that were very good. One was a Crown Financial Study, and the other one was a Dave Ramsey Financial Peace. And both of those studies basically had you do the same activity in the very first thing, What they want you to do is they want you to keep track of all your expenditures for 30 days. Keep a receipt for everything you spend. And then they want you to categorize it and write it down and just figure out what it is. And let me tell you, if you haven't done that in a while, I challenge you to do so because it is eye-opening. Because I don't know if you're like me, but a lot of times what happens is I'll deposit paychecks and we'll know how much money is in there, and at the end of the month, I'm thinking, oh, there must be, X amount of dollars in here. There's got to be $1,000 in here left to do whatever, and I get in there and it's $4. And you're like, where did the money go? And the point of that study is to know exactly where every dollar goes. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that we need to write down how we spend our time, but I really believe that this would be a very productive and scary exercise for us to every day for a week or a month to sit down and say, how much time did you spend, or where did you spend your time? When I started my PhD about 5.5, 6 years ago, my first thought was, what did I used to do with all my free time? Because I thought that I was busy. I really did. I felt like I had no margin in my life. But then all of a sudden, I was doing homework 6 days a week. And I was doing 25-page papers for 7-week courses, and I was doing, 5-page papers during the week, and I was doing 2 class posts during, on Tuesday and Thursday. And I was also doing that and doing all the stuff that I did with church and with family and all that kind of thing. And I realized that I had a lot more free time before that than I ever imagined. And I think if we would account for our time, if we just say, here's how we spend our time, it would help us to be better managers of that time. Number 10, pray about what adjustments need to be made. I think when we pray, we need to consider in our lives a few things. First of all, we got to ask ourselves the old cliche, WWJD. What would Jesus do? If Jesus had my life, okay, if he had your life, then what would he do? How would he spend his time? Take a look. Maybe you take that written down account of what you've done for the week, and you take it and you say, okay, let's compare this to what Jesus would have done. What would Jesus have done in this context? And see the discrepancies and find out what adjustments need to be made. Maybe you take a look and you say, what opportunities did perhaps I miss? Did a friend call you and say, hey, can I come over and hang out? And you're like, I'm sorry, I got to go grocery shopping. I got to go do this, I got to do that. Or did you see an opportunity with a coworker that, excuse me, that you just had to kind of dismiss because you were just too busy? Or what opportunities can you look back on and say, that might have been something I missed out on? And what adjustments would you have to make to be able to deal with that? Or maybe you take a look at those 4 things, prayer and relationship and mission and rest, and you say, okay, this week, I spent 0 time in prayer. Maybe I need to add some of that to my life. Or maybe you say I spent very little time building relationships. Maybe that's what I need to add. Or maybe I spent way too much time resting and not enough mission, or way too much mission and not enough resting. You take a look at those 4 things that Jesus exhibited to us, and you say, what needs more in my life? And guess what? It's just like your budget. Most of us have a limited budget, and the reality is that if we're going to buy one thing, it means we can't buy something else. And the time is the same way. We may need to make adjustments based on those things. But finally, the last one, make the necessary adjustments. I know it seems like a duh moment, but the reality is that much like the case with our faith, this idea of Christian time management, it can't just be something you write down or hear at a sermon. It's something you have to actually take action. You have to make changes. You see, James reminds us that our life is just a mist, that our time is limited. And we can look at videos that say we have 67.2 years left in our life, or years in our life. And some of us are like, woohoo, borrowed time. And some of us are like, oh my gosh, it's creeping up fast. And some of us are like, wow, that's really, I got it forever. But regardless, the point is, it's all limited. And we take a look at that and understand that we are a mist. And so how should that address and change the way we live? We can't control time. We can't stop time. But we can use our time wisely. And we can do that for God's glory. And guess what? My time is up. Let's pray. God, I thank you for who you are and for the gift of time and the way you've just allowed us to live. And Lord, I pray you'll help us to treat time like a commodity that it is. You'll help us to be wise about the way we use it, and so that everything we do, we can do it for you, God. That every decision we make, the way we use our time, will be for your glory. And God, I know, Lord, it's not just a matter of saying, I want to decide to use all my time for you, but it's a matter of saying, how do I practically accomplish that? And so help us to make the adjustments in our life in ways that we can be wise about the way we redeem our time, making the most of every opportunity. Lord, help us to live Kairos lives, not Chronos lives. Help us to live by those opportunities. Help us to see those. Help us to act on those. And let it all be for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand as we sing.